I just got in last night from 2 weeks in Eastern Europe. And then I spent a week in the Ukraine, eastern part of Ukraine, visiting the homes of Holocaust survivors. You see, we've been involved for 11 years now, taking care of Jews who have not been able to go to Israel. For a number of reasons. They're elderly, they're handicapped, and we call them the forgotten people. And we go there to tell them, God has not forgotten you. We serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob just as they do. We're standing in the bottom of what used to be a communist building when the communism reigned in that country. We stood on a tile floor that now was serving soup to elderly Jewish people. One time a day. That was their only meal. And that meal was provided by American Christians. $33 supports a whole household with one meal a day for 3 months. And they told me the story of that very room we stood in was the very room that the communists would torture and kill the Jews of that area. There was blood on the stones that I stood on. I had the privilege to apologize to them as a pastor of the gospel and repent. Do you know why? Because that very building, the very basement that I stood in, was in the shadow of a Christian church next door who did nothing during those days. We're making friends with the enemy of Israel to our own dismay. And I am ashamed of our country for that reason. But I make no apologies. I repent to them. And I tell them, it will not be that way. There are people who love you. There are people who stand with you. Even if you feel forgotten, not all have forgotten you. And certainly, your God has not forgotten you. In September, the world's eyes will be on the United Nations because they are trying to establish a Palestinian state, and the parties of hate and the parties of violence have many, many supporters in the United Nations. It is our time to pray. It is our time to stand in the gap. God says, I'm looking for a man who will stand in the gap. I will stand. Will you? After September 11th, 2001, we had a saying that was made famous by that current president: never again. The Jews have a saying since the Second World War: never again. Never again. She didn't have heat. She couldn't afford it. So we were able to, with $50, we were able to buy little portable kinds of heaters, enough to warm her bedroom. And we got it there. The problem was the snow was so bad that winter, we didn't get it there until February. And when we got there, we found out that she had frozen to death in that time. We cannot let that happen. There is no reason. There is no reason for anyone to freeze to death anywhere, but certainly among the Jews. Elderly Jewish couple She was in the bed 11 years ago, and she was in the bed last Thursday. The same bed for 11 years. 11 years. When we had a time to pray, she has crippling arthritis among many other things, rheumatoid arthritis, among a number of other diseases. They thought she was going to die 2 weeks ago, and they didn't have $250 to bury her. She didn't die. And I talked to our sponsor in that area, and I said, you make sure she has $250. So she told us 2 stories unlike all the other stories that I had heard. Because these 2 stories were positive stories. The very first story was when she got to Auschwitz and unloaded from one of those cattle trains. And she moved. She could see through the slots in the side of the car that they were separating the women before they unloaded her particular car. And she saw that they were moving the ones who had children over to one side. So she thought in her head, if I have a child, mind you, she was a teenager, just 17 at the time. If I have a child, they might let me live. That's how she was thinking. So her aunt, who was with her, had several children, and she talked to her and convinced her to let her hold one of the children. And the aunt said, yes, that'll be fine. So she grabbed up a child when they came to unload her car. And as she unloaded, there was a Nazi officer standing there, and he was deciding who went where. And when she came down the ramp with this child, he took the child from her and told her to go over to the group where there was young ladies. And she reached back and took the child away from him, which was probably not a very smart thing to do, but she was thinking just the opposite. So she grabbed the child back, and he got a little angrier at this point and reached back and took the child again and commanded her to go. For the 3rd time, she started to move towards the child. He pulled out his pistol and pointed it blank in her face. At that point, she released the child because she felt God say to her, this is my plan for you. Trust me. And she left the child and went to that one group. She didn't know that that was the group that lived. The second story she told us was after she had been liberated by the Americans. She had been sent to along with another young lady, a cousin I believe it was, to live with a German woman so that she could regain her health and her strength. And shortly after she had arrived at this home, this old German lady had fixed a big meal and had piled their plate up with food and gave it to her and this other young girl, thinking that since they had been starving and since they were emaciated, that they should eat a lot. And she said, no, you must take this back. Take off 2/3 of this and just leave 1/3. That we shall eat. And the German lady said, why do you not eat? She said this to the lady. She said, because my God has told me not to eat that much, that I should eat a little at a time. Little did she know, or little did the German lady know, that many Holocaust survivors, when they were liberated, they died because they ate too much. The system could not handle it.
Secularstupidist.com, conservative.com, rightosophy.com